What's up, heathens? How are y'all doing? Tonight we have a debate between Richard Carrier and Father James Gad, and we were going to have Captain Dadpool is going to be moderating. We're going to get into, who everybody is tonight here in just a minute. But before that, I do want to do a little bit of house cleaning. Tonight's video is brought to you by, or tonight's debate rather, is brought to you by Crestus. You can check out Crestus by going to crest.us, and you'll be able to download the Crestus app. With the Crestus app, you get a lot of great information about early Christianity and the mythicist position. So if you want to know more about mythicism, or the arguments against common arguments for a historical Jesus, then definitely go check out the Crestus app, and you'll be more enlightened about the mythicist position. Another thing, if you'll notice, I don't have my green screen tonight. I just have my a background. If you'll notice, over there is the gauntlet. We always gotta have the gauntlet, but more importantly, we've got a Humbaba mask in the background. I got that from Digital Hammurabi at Cuneiformations. The Cuneiformations Etsy store. They have a lot of great stuff there. If you like that, definitely go check it out. And of course, we got Marduk over there just hanging out. But tonight we have a lot of great things going on tonight. Primarily the debate, of course, but we've got some really great people here to do the debate. First, I want to introduce Richard Carrier. Richard Carrier has a PhD in the history of philosophy from Columbia University and is a published philosopher and historian, specializing in contemporary philosophy of naturalism and Greco-Roman philosophy, science, and religion, including the origins of Christianity. He blogs regularly, lectures for community groups worldwide, and teaches courses online. He is the author of many books, including Sense and Goodness Without God, On the Historicity of Jesus, and The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, as well as chapters in several anthologies and articles in academic journals. For more about Dr. Carrier and his work, you can go to richardcarrier.info. And then we've also got Father James Gad. Father James Gad is a former independent fundamentalist Baptist who was an agnostic for part of his college life and switched majors to philosophy in order to ask and answer the big questions. When he rediscovered Christianity, he found himself attracted to the Anglican tradition, wherein he was confirmed in 2013. Father James attended Trinity School for Ministry and received his Master of Divinity on his first try in 2020, and is now an assisting priest and third grade teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area. He runs the almost popular YouTube channel Barely Protestant, in which he makes videos about Christianity, especially Anglicanism. He is the author of about 5 or 6 books that are still in his computer, not yet published or even finished, and he needs to get on that quick, fast, and in a hurry. And then finally, to introduce our moderator tonight, we have Captain Dadpool. Captain Dadpool has a major TikTok presence, and he's also got a YouTube channel and a Twitter. So if you guys like the interaction with Captain Dadpool tonight, definitely go check him out. He puts out great content. I think with all of that out of the way, I think we're going to get to Captain Dadpool to introduce our structure for tonight, and then we'll also be getting on into the debate, if I can actually work all of these nice little buttons that I have laid out here, which will run much smoother, and I'm filling time right now in case you cannot tell. So anyways, without further ado, here is Captain Dadpool.
So tonight we are going to start with 2 10-minute openers, or a 10-minute opener for each, starting with Father Gad, followed by Dr. Carrier. Then we're going to have a 5-minute response period. Then we are going to have an open discussion. I'm not sure how long that will be, but we'll feel it out. And then there's going to be an audience Q&A. And the question's going to be directed towards either Dr. Carey or Father Gad. So that's pretty much what our format is. With that out of the way, I'm ready to get started. Father Gad, I believe you're first.
All right, just let me know whenever the timer starts.
Not sure myself.
Okay, no worries.
There we go. All right.
Oh, ready? Okay. Good evening. I want to thank John Gleason and Wes and Captain Dadpool and everyone else for allowing me to take part in this debate. And I want to thank Dr. Carrier for this opportunity to have such an important dialogue here. The question at hand this evening is how best to approach the Gospels when looking at them historically, with a special emphasis on the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Before us tonight are two options. We either take them as purely fictitious or as historically reliable enough to affirm with a high degree of certainty the existence of a first-century Jewish rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified and soon after declared to have been risen from the dead by his closest followers, which then sparked the advent of Christianity. One of the first things I need to point out is that in this approach to history, we need to make sure that we are conservative in our approach. Now, what do I mean by that? Am I saying that we need to vote Republican whenever we read a history book or wear a MAGA hat? Although these things might please my mother, who is a hardcore Trump supporter, this is not what I mean. What I mean is that we need to make as few conjectures as possible. If we wish to argue that two texts are connected, let's call them text A and text B, we need to have strong positive arguments as to why that is, or at least likely is, the case. The fact that they both talk about the same generic or general topic is not sufficient evidence that one either borrows from the other or that the authors even knew of the other text or author. The issue I have here is that Dr. Carrier continually makes such connections like this. One of the biggest examples is the ascension of Isaiah being connected theologically to the Pauline theology and the Pauline corpus. He doesn't claim that it affects or influences Paul, but shows it to be parallel to what Paul is saying. We do not have positive evidence that the Pauline sect of Christianity in any way helped to the ascension of Isaiah. Carrier has, skipping down to that part. In Dr. Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, he tells us that we should approach the question of whether or not Jesus existed with a minimal facts approach of each. What are the minimal points needed for verifying the idea that Jesus actually existing in history is true? Likewise, what are the minimal points needed for verifying that Jesus was a myth? In other words, we do not argue that if we proved one or even all of the miracles in the gospel, according to St. Matthew, never happened, then therefore Jesus never existed. Why? Because the vast majority of atheist and other non-Christian New Testament scholars reject the miracle claims in Matthew and the other Gospels, yet almost universally believe Jesus existed. That's not a fallacious appeal to authority, as I'm sure Dr. Carrier will agree, since he points this out himself. Likewise, it's not enough to show that someone like Dan Barker or the Zeitgeist movie are wildly inaccurate and sometimes it seems to be flat out lying in their claims concerning Jesus' mythicism, and therefore mythicism is false. That would not be a proper ruling of the evidence given. Those arguments are largely not the ones that Dr. Carrier is presenting tonight. Rather, what we're doing is we're seeing what is the most likely to be true, even on a minimalist approach of either. We don't need to argue that Jesus was borrowing, or the followers of Jesus as a myth were borrowing from every single thing in all of the ancient world. Neither do we need to prove or show strong evidence for the fact that every single thing in the Gospels is as claimed to be true is true. Now, as a Christian, I believe that, but I'm defending a more limited approach today. Here is the position I am defending tonight. There was an actual historical Jesus, described by his followers in various writings surviving to this day, whose teaching, ministry, death, and proclaimed resurrection sparked a movement that is today known as Christianity. I am focusing, as I said, upon the Gospel according to St. Matthew for this defense, though other texts will be referenced. Matthew's gospel is Jewish in its approach to Jesus. We continually see Matthew quoting and citing the Old Testament, and we are unaware of him citing anything else as scripture that is not within any of those collections. Well, it seems to be the case that there was not one single canon of the Old Testament at the time, and that slight controversy comes down to us this day with the fact that various Protestant, Roman, and Eastern sects have slight differences in their canons. We don't recognize various strong pagan influences upon the writings of Matthew. Nowhere do we see ideas of, for instance, cosmic sperm banks or Jesus being killed in the heavens in these Gospels, as argued by Dr. Carrier. Dr. Carrier argues that these are likely what St. Paul held to, and that Matthew makes allusions to that not allusions to that, but Matthew builds upon that, making an entire legend based upon ultimately Mark and beyond that, the writings of St. Paul. He would need to demonstrate two things tonight in order to defend his greater argument that Jesus was merely a legend. He needs to first demonstrate that St. Paul did or likely did believe these things. This will need to have either explicit claims in St. Paul's writings or at least strong scriptural or other sorts of evidence from sources that we know he considered authoritative, rather than a mere assertion and loose association. And I will get to the problem with loose associations later on. He will need to demonstrate that the Gospels were dependent upon him, upon St. Paul, and were constructing whole cloth, this whole narrative, as fiction. This part can't be asserted, and making parallels is not a strong enough argument by any stretch of the imagination, as we will see. We need a positive argument for understanding the idea that Mark and the subsequent Gospels were ultimately only dependent upon this mythicized Jesus and decided to invent this character whole cloth and build a story around him that is placing him upon earth. Matthew and the other Gospels name eyewitnesses in their writings. These are Gospels written for the Christian community. Dr. Carrier has to resort to speculation on such people as Simon of Cyrene and others such as Jairus, Cleopas, Simon the Pharisee, Malchus, and others. At this point, I'm looking at all of the canonical Gospels. They are also not all mentioned by name. Some are mentioned in Mark and Luke, but not Matthew. Some are mentioned in Mark and Matthew, but not Luke. A rather simple explanation is that these were mentioned or not mentioned based upon the knowledge the community the author was writing to had. Dr. Carey has to give fictional, secretive narratives that are based upon speculation rather than the information directly presented to us. This is rather strong evidence that Matthew and the other Gospels draw from independent sources and do not rely upon or extrapolate from Mark. This is most especially true when looking at the Gospel according to St. John. There is a reason it is not considered part of the Synoptic Gospels. It shows almost no evidence of dependence upon Mark and the others. All of the evidence we have in history seems to point to the followers of Jesus believing he was and is a real flesh and blood person. We have no solid positive evidence for this mythicist sect that only places a flesh and blood Jesus in the heavens and not in the earth. Christianity was not a well-organized or well-funded sect. There were no controlling mechanisms in the early church to stamp out a now missing mythicist sect, especially given that they apparently shared the vast majority of the same scriptures, which would indicate that they were in the same communities. This in-house debate would almost certainly have been recorded. For instance, we have the Docetists, arguments given against them. We have the rather amorphous Gnostics, which is actually a variety of sects, and various other sects recorded and argued against. These heresies would be equally as horrible to the so-called historicist sect as some alleged mythicist sect would be. Yet the arguments against them were recorded and strongly recorded. There are quite a few examples of that, but we don't have any book against the mythicists that we see within church history that I'm aware of, at least. And I want to now talk about one of the issues I have, and I think this is the sort of fundamental issue I have with what I see with Dr. Carrier and other mythicists when it comes to their sort of approach to history. We see these rather loose connections and associations made with other stories that we don't have solid reasons to believe that they actually were pulling from. I wanted to give a few examples in history. I hope I have enough time for this. I may not, but one of the issues is making these connections between, say, Mithras or Osiris or others, and saying, therefore, they were pulling from that those narratives and therefore making it an entirely legendary account. The problem with that is that we can actually do the same thing with history that we know is true. For instance, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the United States. And the United States has 50 states today. Is this coincidence? Was this some sort of myth that was made up 200 years after the fact? No, this is not a myth. This is actually recorded history that we know. One actually I got and elaborated on with from Mike Lacona. So this one I call 9/11 in the Empire State Building. A plane took off out of Massachusetts at 9 a.m. Just after 10 a.m. It flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in New York City between the 78th and 80th floors, killing everyone aboard. However, this was not the 767 plane that from 9/11. This was the B-25 plane, and this was in July 28th, 1945. The plane for 9/11 was a 767, and here I am going to be making sort of connections between these two events that we know are historical events, but that we, if we're going to approach history the way that Dr. Carrier does, we're going to find that we can make connections in all of these sorts of things. So 767, if I mythicize this, it's a partial inversion of the number 666, showing both the number of man, 666, but adding on the edges the number of God, 7, to show that ultimately it was an act of God, not man, showing that this is a mythicized view. The World Trade Center collapsing is symbolic of the god of greed being cast down. It was placed before the resurgence of atheism, the so-called new atheism, because it was intended as a prophecy of the greed of mankind. And we all know how greedy atheists are. That's a joke. The Pentagon was crashed into because of the symbolism of post-Cold War military decline. It symbolizes a call to arms. The farm field crash shows a few things. God cursing the ground, which is a symbolic explanation for the decline in farming, and America's decline in general, as it is a reference to the then popular movie.
Hey,
The Field of
Father
Dreams.
Gad, you're about out of time.
Do you mind
if you can wrap it up within the
yeah.
if you can wrap it in the next like few seconds, that's cool.
Yeah, we'll do. The Field of Dreams, about ghosts playing on a field, and we all know that baseball is a representation for American greatness. And its decline is seen in the ghosts playing this game, as the ghosts of those in the airplane are obviously going to take part in the game of baseball now. And who plays in the Field of Dreams? James Earl Jones, who also plays the voice of Darth Vader, but not the body of Darth Vader, in the movie series Star Wars, a movie series that no historian will claim is real, but is based upon the possibly real events of World War II. And when does that allegedly take place? Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, this World War ends in 1945, the exact year that this B-25, which is a bomber, also connected to the Muslim terrorists who are often called bombers. So we can make these sorts of connections at any time in any way that we want to. So this is not evidence. What this shows is that you have to go stronger than this, and I'll end my time there. Sorry for going.
All right. Very good. I apologize for not updating you on the time. So we're going to give Dr. Carrier an extra 3 minutes for his intro, if that's all right. And Dr. Carrier, the floor is yours. You're muted, Dr. Carrier.
Sorry, there we go.
There we go. All right.
How's that? This isn't really the debate I thought we were going to have, but that's fine. I actually agree with a lot of what Father Gad said, because I don't actually argue any of those things on the Historicity of Jesus, which is the peer-reviewed book in which I propose that the mythicism, the non-historicity of Jesus is plausible and could be more probable than not. So that isn't an argument that relies solely on the Gospels. I don't think if we need more than that. So there's a lot more discussion of the epistles, a lot of discussion of the external evidence, and so on. I'd expected that we were going to talk about like how we should historically use the Gospels and approach them, and I'll get into that. So I'm going to focus on the Gospels. I'm not going to drift too much into the epistles, for example, because I think people have come here to hear us talk about how we should interpret the Gospels. The first thing, though, I need to dispute is this false dichotomy that the Gospels are either purely fictitious or reasonably reliable. That's a false dichotomy. Most literature is in between, especially ancient literature. And this is ancient religious literature. This is a thing I point out on the Historicity of Jesus, that the normal mode of production of religious literature in the ancient world is to highly fictionalize and highly fabricate, even if it's built around core history. So for the purposes here, I mean, in fact, even in my book, I say that the historical Jesus that got the religion started is entirely plausible. I think that is a plausible theory. I don't think it has the evidence to back it that people think it does. And so that's my argument, is not either or. It's not of absolute certainty, not that we can just disprove Jesus existed. It's that I think that there's more reason to doubt Jesus existed than people are willing to grant. Because there are other ways these religions can start. And the example would be the Moroni Mormonism model, where Jesus would be in the role of Moroni. The actual founder would be Peter, who would be the Joseph Smith in this scenario. And that's the way that the epistles talk about Jesus, as someone that you meet in Revelations. Paul says, Christ revealed himself in me. And Paul never seems to know about any other way of people seeing Jesus. And it's this discrepancy between how the epistles approach how people know about Jesus and what Jesus preached, and the Gospels that lays the foundation for why we start to have to really be more suspicious of what's going on in the Gospels. But we can also look at the Gospels internally and see legitimate reasons, not only because religious literature, hagiography like this, sacred literature like this, is usually highly unreliable, usually highly fabricatory. So we have a starting reason to doubt this. We have tons of biographies from the first century and the Roman Empire period and earlier of non-existent people that were written like rationalist biographies, as if these people existed. We have the lives of Aesop. We have the life of Romulus. We have quasi-biographies that are similar to the Gospels of Osiris, who never was a pharaoh, but was portrayed as such in these Gospels. So we know this kind of thing happened all the time. So the question is, we got to look at the Gospels and say, are the Gospels like this other religious literature, or is it more like the rational historians that we have of the period? And when you look at the markers, they're definitely much more like religious literature. They're written like fable. And so let's get through some of the things that Father Gad said. It's unclear. It sounds like Father Gad's willing to grant that the Gospels are making things up or are credulously reporting false claims. If we're going to say that the miracles, we're going to reject the miracles, the walking on water, the killing thousands of pigs, the visiting Moses and Elijah on a mountain, flying through the air with the devil, all of these things, that there's tons of, the sun going out for 3 hours, is like a lot of, absurd things that happen in the Gospels. Even not just miraculous things. When Jesus walks up to the first apostles and he says 2 sentences, and they leave their jobs and their lives and their families and immediately follow him as fanatical believers in his gospel. No way that happened. That is not a historically plausible story. That is fable. That is how things happen in fables. That's how ancient fable was written. And you can go through pericope through pericope through pericope in the Gospels, and they're all written like fables. And in fact, they follow the literary model of fabulous writing that was specifically taught in schools of the time. That if you learn to write Greek the way Matthew does, he definitely was taught this technique of composing fictional stories. And it's where you go from just vignette to vignette to vignette. There's no historical causal model. There's no historical consciousness. The historian, the writer, is not identifying himself or how he knows anything. He never shows any critical judgment. He's never analyzing what's true and what's false. He's never exposing historical consciousness to the reader. Never mentions his sources or even having sources. So these are all markers that are very typical of fable and mythography and hagiography of the time. They're not typical features of historiography. So when we look at so there might be a kernel of truth in there. But there's so much myth built on top of it that it's exceedingly difficult to figure out what's true and what's not. Now, there's some things. One of the ways we do this is corroboration. So, for instance, we know from external evidence, abundant independent authors and archaeology, that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea around the time that this is portrayed as having happened. So we can independently corroborate Pontius Pilate. That part of the Gospels is true. Now, what he says and his interactions with Jesus, that might be fictional. We don't know, because we have no corroboration for that. The interactions that are depicted in the Gospels are not plausible historically, given the independent evidence we have regarding how Pontius Pilate would actually behave. So we do have reason to be suspicious of this, but we're given no sources on this, and none of this goes back to eyewitnesses that we can show. We have no evidence that we can trace it back to eyewitness sources. So this is the reason why we're highly skeptical of the Gospels. It's very difficult to use them as reliable sources. They aren't reliable sources, but even unreliable sources can sometimes have kernels of truth that you can grab out of there, and it's very difficult to do that in the case of Jesus. Let's see. So that's the general point I want to make. Father Gad focused a lot on pagan influences. I think that's kind of a distraction. I think Christians kind of freak out at the idea that maybe pagan literature, Gentile literature, was used as models for building these gospels. That shouldn't be weird. If you learned Greek in Greek school, that's what you were taught to do. So obviously they're going to use literary models that are familiar to other educated Greeks. That's what they're going to do. But we can make the point using the one that's fully accepted. Since Father Gad likes consensus, let's talk about mainstream consensus. The mainstream consensus agrees that a lot of the stories about Jesus are direct lifts and emulations of stories about Moses and Elijah. So they take a lot of stories about Moses and Elijah and rework them, modernize them, and retell them, and put Jesus as the central character in them. And this is mainstream. All mainstream scholars accept this. There's a lot of authors who've written on this, tons of peer-reviewed literature on it. It's pretty much accepted that this is a lot of the stories that are told about Jesus are just reworkings of stories told about Moses and Elijah. The nativity is a classic example in the case of Moses. The resurrection of Jairus' daughter is a classic example of a lift from a rewrite of a story from Elijah, and so on. So this is not. I'm not out on a limb here. This is actually mainstream scholarship. They accept that the authors are emulating previous sources. And that's acceptable in the field as long as it's Jewish sources they're emulating. But as soon as you start suggesting they're emulating pagan sources, well, now people start to freak out, even though the same rules, the same principles, and the same techniques actually show up and would corroborate that. But I'm willing to just dismiss that entirely for the purposes of this debate. We don't need pagan models. We have all of these Jewish models. But we do have pagan models that they clearly are using. So a classic example is Luke, or rather than focusing on Matthew, look at Luke. His Emmaus narrative, which is unknown to Matthew and Mark, his Emmaus narrative has a lot of direct lifts from the Romulus story, where the hero disappears and then appears on the road to a distraught follower, and explains to him his resurrection and the gospel and all of this stuff. In the Romulus story, he appears in glorious visage as a great resurrected deity, and he explains that he was incarnated as a mortal to spread the gospel of the Roman Empire, basically, and then died and then rose again, and is now wants his Proculus, his friend, to actually go into the city and tell the story. But there's also other narratives. There's hidden angel narratives and hidden God narratives where people meet a god or an angel, but they don't know that it's a god or an angel because they're in disguise. They're in supernatural disguise. And often this is done to test people. What Luke has done is he's taken both of these stories, the Romulus narrative and the very common urban legends of hidden gods and hidden angel narratives, and merged them to make a Christian gospel version that is superior to the Romulus version because Jesus appears in humble visage. He appears as in disguise. They don't recognize him. They don't know who he is. They just think he's just a wanderer, a traveler that they're going with. And it's only when they break bread with him that suddenly they realize that he's Jesus. And then, of course, he vanishes suddenly. And so we have actually a vanishing hitchhiker narrative. That's how old the vanishing hitchhiker storyline is.
About 3 minutes left, Dr. Carrier.
Goes back to this. So when we look at the way these stories are doing, there definitely are borrowing models from pagan literature, but they're doing it to upgrade them and make them Jewish and make them more Christian, to actually improve the values and the messages of them. So it shouldn't be anything offensive about this. This is how people composed religious stories back in the ancient world. There's a lot more that I could say about the minutia of things. We can get into that depending on what Father God wants to focus on. But let's see, what should I hit on before my time runs out? Okay, so Father God mentions that we should have discussion of mythicists. Actually, we do, so we can get into that discussion. Both Ignatius and 2 Peter, the forgery of 2 Peter, directly reference competing sects of Christians who believe that they were believing in myths and not real things, that the stories are cleverly devised myths, that Jesus didn't really do any of the things, or didn't really die, didn't really eat in front of the disciples, and so on. So we know that there were these sects, but none of the literature that extensively combats them, or none of their literature either, survives. It was destroyed. It wasn't preserved. But we have references to it in Ignatius and 2 Peter, for example. So we know that's a thing. But also we have no references to any discussions of the Gospels in the 1st century. All of the stuff we have is 50 to 100 years later. It's in the 2nd century. And when we look at the authors, the Christians at that time, it's clear they don't have any information about who really wrote the Gospels or what was really going on at the time they were written. Our earliest source for this is Papias, And he thinks Matthew wrote in Hebrew, which is impossible. He's copying Greek texts. He's using a Septuagint, the Greek translation of Scripture, as his base text. So there's no way that's true. Papias has no knowledge of Matthew being a disciple or being an eyewitness. He incorrectly thinks Mark is writing Peter's gospel, when in fact Mark is an anti-Petrine gospel. He's actually supporting the Pauline sect, who was pro-Gentile, against the Petrine sect, who is actually, Matthew's text is actually more in line with what Peter would have been teaching. So already our earliest source in the early 2nd century, we're talking 130 or so AD, Christians don't even know their own history at this point. So it's clear there's very little information available to them about the 1st century of the religion. And what we get is mostly this sort of historicist offshoot that came around later. And that's simply how the sources pan out. When you look at the letter of Pliny the Younger, he mentions that most of the people that he met, they were accused of being Christians, had left the faith ages ago, some of them decades ago. It was exceedingly difficult for him to find Christians to persecute. He knew nothing about what Christians taught. So this is how small the Christian sect was and how unknown it was. So they didn't even know their own history. The outsiders didn't know hardly anything about them. It was they only grew up as a major religion, or started to become a major religion, in the 2nd century. By then, this is lifetimes later. No one could really vet or check the origins of these stories.
All right, that is time. Very good. So now we are going to move to our 5-minute rebuttal period. And Father Gad, we're going to start with you. Are you ready? You're muted. Still muted.
Yeah.
There we go.
I'm looking at the notes I'm writing down. Sorry, apologies. All right. My notes are a little bit scrambled with all this, so I'm not going directly in the same order. So the false dichotomy accusation. So I want to point out, maybe it was misunderstood. I specified that I was talking about the Gospels being false concerning the person of Jesus himself, not that they were purely 100% myth. That was the dichotomy I was presenting.
I love that I could listen to Richard Kerr say all that. Like, yep, that's true. Yep, that's right.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Pontius Pilate was known as a cruel ruler. Why would it be unreasonable to posit that he'd have Jesus killed? I'm not sure what the myth part, maybe he's talking about the Barabbas part, or the desire of Pontius Pilate to not have Jesus killed. That is likely what he's referring to, but that doesn't therefore conclude that the fact that Pontius Pilate killed Jesus is a myth. We'd have to, that's that leap that we need to demonstrate rather than just assume. I never said that I like consensus. I'm trying to make a neutral ground here between myself and him. And so I'm trying to cede as much using that minimal facts mentality. See what else? Every non-Christian would most likely argue. Okay, so concerning Ignatius and 2 Peter, every non-Christian most likely would argue that there were myths associated with Christianity. We're not talking about whether or not myths are associated with Christianity. I mean, as a devout Christian, I would probably be considered a fundamentalist by you. I believe that there were early church myths associated with Christianity. That is not the same as saying that Jesus himself never existed. So the idea in 1 Peter or in Ignatius that there are just general myths about Christianity, everyone literally believes that. Like, there's no one who would deny that. So let's see. Concerning Papias, I didn't bring up Papias, although I was tempted to. I wanted to do a bit more research on Papias, but I do want to know if Carrier does consider the Matthew that Papias is talking about to be the Matthew that we have. I don't remember. I think I remember you saying in the past that you didn't consider it to be that. That's just for clarification on my end. Also, my understanding is that Romulus is not universally recognized as pure myth. There is actually, as my understanding is, the debate on whether or not Romulus and Remus did exist. Also, one of the issues, we don't look at Romulus and Remus in that story and say, well, these people didn't exist because there's such crazy claims in them. The bigger part is that it's hundreds and hundreds of years later before we get the first story about them that we have recorded today. The Gospels are written within the same century. And so it doesn't have that sort of time to develop into a question of like, well, does this guy even exist? The myths are generally based upon people, whether obviously whether living or fake, but the idea of it just sort of popping into space out of almost nothing, other than maybe 3 people having hallucinations and then influencing others to have hallucinations, and then 4 gospels within a few decades getting written out of that, seems to be a really, really long stretch, I'm going to say. Let's see. I also want to point out, and I do want to ask this during the open discussion, the understanding is, as I've heard from you before, is that you're about sort of 2/3 convinced that Jesus was not any sort of historical character, which is a significant 1/3, meaning that you think that he did. And so for me, the question is, I admit I'm not a scholar. This is something I want to get into, New Testament studies. But the question for me then is, as someone who is watching this, who is not a scholar, what advice would you have for them with that, given that one scholar is claiming a 2/3 certainty that Jesus didn't exist, while the vast majority of the rest of scholarship relevant to this field would say with much more certainty that Jesus did exist as
60 seconds left.
Historical character. I'd love to hear your response to that. And anyway, wait, 60 seconds left? Is it you said?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have a minute left. All right.
I do want to keep going.
Let's see what else I have. Yeah. I also want to, I really want to focus upon the question of making these connections with other stories, whether they're pagan or whether they are from the Old Testament itself. I then point back to my B25 and 767, 9/11 example, or the John Adams and Thomas Jefferson one, or there's others, even John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln. There are some connections between the two that we can make parallels like that. And I'd like to know, like, does Dr. Carrier consider that to be a strong enough approach when trying to find these connections? I'm done now.
All right, that is time. Perfect. Dr. Carrier, your response.
All right, yeah, I'll start with that last thing, since you're right. I overlooked that part and didn't throw that in. I kind of threw it away at the beginning because I mentioned that I don't really make the kind of argument that you were saying. But you did make that one point that I should have said something about, which was the parallels. You're confusing 2 different kinds of things. There's sort of random parallels, which is what's called the multiple comparisons fallacy, where if you get to compare anything to anything, you have hundreds and hundreds of things to compare, you will always find parallels. So that is a fallacy. But in literary analysis, and this is mainstream literary analysis in the field of literature, in the field of history, parallel structural analysis follows certain patterns, and there's certain rules and criteria by which you can show that parallels cannot be random, that they actually are not accidental, that they are causal. And so there's a whole procedure for this. There's a lot of literature on it about how it's done. And a classic example is how we show that the infancy narrative in Matthew is a redevelopment of the infancy narrative of Moses. And so it's not like, oh, it's just a random coincidence that the stories are the same. No, we know that Matthew is deliberately crafting his infancy narrative to update the Moses narrative into the historical time. So instead of Pharaoh, it's Herod. Instead of certain like atrocities that Pharaoh commits, and he has Herod killing the babies. So this is the kind of creativity that was specifically taught in schools of the time. So we know this is what to expect. And I show some examples of this in outside literary analysis, not related to Christianity, as examples in my book on the historicity of Jesus, in the chapter of the Gospels, where I show how this is done. And other authors have done this as well. Richard Miller did a really excellent book, his dissertation that was published later, on vanishing God narratives. That shows how Mark modeled his storyline, and Matthew borrowed this storyline. But it was borrowed very much on this common mythology of vanishing bodies and resurrected heroes. And there's tons of literary analysis that show this. It's not just random parallels. They're structural parallels. They're the kind of parallels that are highly unlikely to just be there randomly. And so that is the argument you have to make. You have to tell the difference between what type of parallel argument you're making. And to illustrate that from the other side, I fully agree that there's a lot of ridiculous parallelomania out there. In fact, I think there's over-exaggerated attempts to find parallels between Jesus and other pagan deities. So that needs more discipline. And so in the book on the historicity of Jesus, I am far more disciplined in what I find as arguable and legitimate parallels and which don't. So and I'm using techniques that are built in the field. They're mainstream consensus techniques that everybody uses. So there's nothing actually weird about this. And so that's the difference on that point. But to hit the other points on the way down, I'm arguing that we just can't prove Jesus didn't exist. We can't prove Jesus didn't exist merely from the Gospels, nor can we prove he did merely from the Gospels. We need more, right? So there's got to be more of an argument based on that. The question is, can we use the Gospels as evidence for Jesus? And the answer is no, for the same reason that we can use them to say that Pontius Pilate existed, because we have the corroboration for Pilate we don't have for Jesus. Whereas, unlike all the histories of Pilate, the Gospels are highly mythical. Their structure has all the markers of mythography. And when we look at all other books that have those markers, their heroes typically, most commonly, didn't exist. So our starting assumption should be that Jesus is just like all the other mythologized heroes that we have, that they typically don't exist. And then you would need more evidence to actually say that Jesus is one of the exceptions. And there are many exceptions. And you can point to, there's historical people that had a lot of myth built around them. But they're not as common as the non-existent people who got myths and biographies written about them. So you need some sort of technique, some sort of evidence or something that allows you to do this. And the only argument that I make on the historicity of Jesus is that we lack that. We just don't have what we need to bootstrap these mythographies into histories. And that's a much more different argument than I think you think I'm making in there. When we get to minimal facts, we've got to talk about what are the trends, what is usual. When we look at ancient religious literature, it's usually made up. When we look at mythical heroes that are written about in this particular way, they usually don't exist. These are minimal facts. These should be starting assumptions. The prior probability is based on what usually happened. And then if we want to show that Jesus is an exception, that he's somehow special, that we have more evidence for him than these others,
60 seconds.
We have to actually do that. We can get into why I think Matthew wrote in Greek. There's tons of evidence. I can bring up Dale Allison and various others on that. There's no historian who thinks Romulus existed. It's a very classic myth. I mean, the myth was, like you mentioned, was invented hundreds of years after the fact. It's heavily based on a Greek myth of a couple of twins that they just poured it over and redid them into that. Romulus is a fake name, right? It just means like little Rome. So it's baby Rome, and he's the founder of Rome. I mean, when you hear that, it's like Adam is, if you look at Adam and Abraham, all their names are bogus. They're names that describe what they do in the story, which is a classic marker for mythical people. And that's how most historians approach that stuff. And then the time span issue. Actually, we have many examples of whole class of people being invented. Tom Frum and Ned Ludd, for example, within 40 years were completely invented with completely fabricated biographies, and yet believed to be historical people. So we know that can happen. 40 years back then was an average lifetime, and they didn't have newspapers. They didn't have the kinds of things that could prevent this kind of rapid legendary development. So that was actually not abnormal. That's actually normal. I think that's it, right? So we can get into other things as we go when we get to the discussion.
All right, that is time. So we'll move into our open discussion. Before we do that, after our open discussion, we're going to be doing the audience Q&A. So if you have questions in the comments, feel free to ask them. If you have super chats, or if you want to post a super chat, that of course will be bumped to the top of the line. So if you have a question you really want answered, feel free to leave a super chat. I'm not sure how long the open discussion period is supposed to take, honestly. So I'm going to wait back for a response to that from John. But there's no reason we can't get started.
So, Father Gad, there was one thing I know you asked me to answer that I didn't. I'm wondering if we want me to go into that, which is the why do most historians? Why am I alone? Is what I think kind of like the argument.
No, that's not my argument. No. That was not my argument.
Oh yeah.
I'm trying to be very careful.
Rephrase. Yeah.
So my argument is, given someone who is not a scholar, but you have someone who's a scholar before you, sort of utilizing Bayesian. A Bayesian approach to this. They see one scholar saying one position and almost every other scholar saying an entirely opposed position. And even that one scholar is only two-thirds, is only pointing to a two-thirds. So based upon that, not being someone who doesn't have time to go into all the scholarship, him or herself, what should that person do? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, the first question is, do you care? So I think if someone doesn't even care whether Jesus existed or not, then I'd say don't waste your time. But if you care, like if this is actually important to you for whatever reason, you actually can go and get into the scholarship and compare the arguments, right? So you want to see, like, if there's a disagreement in the field, you want to see, is the disagreement informed? So for example, if you have one whole field against one small group of scholars, you want to see, first of all, you want to see if they're getting anything through peer review. We've done that. We've two books now under peer review arguing for Jesus agnosticism. And there's about 20 scholars, or nearly 20 scholars, major significant scholars with full qualifications, who agree that we've at least got an argument, that it's at least plausible. They might not necessarily full on board saying Jesus didn't exist, but they at least say it's plausible. Roughly half of them are even at least at agnosticism about the historicity of Jesus. And that's expanded from about 5 or 6 of us in 2014 when I published. And so now we're up to almost 20. And what I find is the main difference is that the scholars who say that versus the scholars who are against it actually read my book. I find that the critics, when they try to criticize my book, do not accurately represent what's even in the book or what the arguments are. And this is something that you don't have to take my word for. You can actually go read the book, go read the critics and say, did the critic actually address the argument of this book? Or did they misrepresent the argument of this book? And that's something anybody could do. You don't have to be a scholar. You can go and look and check to see, is that what's actually happening here? Or does the consensus actually have a good, strong case against the alternative view? And there's a good example of this is Bermejo Rubio's case for Jesus being well, I don't want to say zealot, but because he says he doesn't call him a zealot, but he kind of argues that Jesus was a militant, right? That he actually attacked the temple with the armed force, and that he was whitewashed as he was whitewashed as a pacifist. Now, this is the zealot hypothesis. It's not new in the field. That this is actually one of the minor views of historicists in the field. So it's not even that radical. I think it's ridiculous, but the mainstream scholars agree that it's at least plausible and worthy of being brought to the table for debate. I think if you're willing to accept that as a plausible thing to discuss, then I think the non-existence of Jesus theory fits in there as well.
I have a question, and this will help sort of frame everything. Would you give a sort of hypothesis? I'm not going to commit you to any particular things necessarily, of just sort of what you see in the development of Christianity from the very first moment or the earliest moment that you can get.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've answered it on various blogs, but I've ported a lot of that into my latest book, which is Jesus from Outer Space, which is the short 200-page thing.
I've unfortunately not been able to read that one yet. Sorry. Yeah.
That's the one I would recommend people read who want to get a start on this, right? Because I do address those kinds of those are the arguments that people are more, I think the public is more interested in. I mean, I have stuff like that on the historicity of Jesus, but it's very structural and academic, and I think people miss it. And part of the answer is that, of course, we don't know specifically, so I can't give you this elaborate specific narrative. The way, for example, the mythicists who think that the Romans invented the Gospels and invented Christianity, the Roman elite did this at the emperors. I totally reject this theory. I think it's absurd. But they have this extremely elaborate, detailed thesis about all these things that happened and how it developed, for which they have no evidence. We can't do things like that a lot of the time. We don't have that kind of documentation for early Christianity. Unlike Mormonism, where we can do that because we have really good documentation for the origins of Mormonism. So I can't say specifics, but I can give a general outline of what must have happened. And we get into the letters of Paul, which is just, there's this revelation of the Christ, however that came to people. Not necessarily hallucination, might have been dreams, because people took dreams seriously back then as actual visitations of the deity. They reported that the great atonement has happened, and the end of the world will now proceed, and the resurrection has begun. Basically, is how that started. And then within 40 years, sects developed. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to. I apologize in advance, but I might be interrupting a little bit just to ask clarifying questions.
You absolutely should. I don't want to be talking all the time. I want you to get some time too to
so
interject and steer me.
Yeah, so the earliest, we both agree that the earliest writings are, the Pauline epistles. So what I've noticed with what I've read of your writing is that it seems that you're saying that Mark either only knows the Pauline epistles or just sort of knows the Pauline community. Is it, or am I misunderstanding you?
No, not at all. In my book, I don't really make this argument, but I have done on the blog, on my blog, and a lot of other scholars have done this, and I agree with them, which is that Mark is definitely reifying Paul's epistles. Mark knows Paul's epistles really well, and his story just basically takes stories and things and details from Paul and turns them into Jesus stories. A classic example is Paul clearly had no knowledge of Jesus teaching anything about taxes, but Paul has a teaching about taxes. It's his So Mark writes a story, a fictional story about this argument that Jesus has with people, in which what comes out of Jesus's mouth is Paul's argument about, and it's done in a clever, pithy way, right? It's the wise sage, sort of the Aesop model, but it's not literally like the words of Paul. But that's not the point. So,
well,
but that's an example of what
teaching,
I think Mark is doing.
Yeah, I don't think they're teaching the same exact thing, though. Like,
it might not be the exact same thing, but it's largely the same thing. Yeah.
I don't think a generic sort of like respect the governing authorities over you is specific enough to be like, well, he obviously clearly, and that goes to that jump thing that I'm talking about, where I see that as way too big of a leap when we don't see any sort of literary connection at the very least with it.
Oh, there's I mean,
hardly a connection.
If that were all
talking about.
Yeah, if that were the only thing we had, I would agree with you, right? Like if that were the only example, then I'd say, oh, that's weak. But it's when you find this happening over and over and over and over and over again throughout, and that's when things start to get very suspicious. And it is the way that Mark writes about Peter, for example, really tracks the way Paul writes about Peter. There's even like chiastic structure in Mark that I can't go into here because I would need a whiteboard basically to show it. But I go into it in my
chiastic structure is a little bit odd, yeah. If you go on the Peter one, then.
Well, yeah, it's just a depiction of Peter, right? So the way that Peter gets rebuked, Mark is borrowing ideas from from Galatians 2, right? For the way Peter gets rebuked, and the whole story arc for Peter is very similar to Paul's attitudes about Peter. So there's a lot of things like that.
Let me ask a question there real quick. Yeah. So with that one, then the question is, I mean, supposing that Peter is actually, I think you imagine Peter to be a real person because St. Paul talks about
that. We have good evidence for. Well, at least we have enough evidence.
So it does seem that there's good reason to believe that Peter is some sort of bombastic person, and like he has the same personality within, given what we see within Paul, as well as within Mark. Would you? So it would have to be that way.
I don't think we have that much data. No, Mark. I mean, Paul is not. He doesn't give really detailed narratives about Peter, so I don't think we can say bombastic or whatever. So, I wouldn't say that. I don't think we know that much about Peter. That was it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, no, okay.
I just. I'm trying to look up my article. So if you wanted to get more examples, if you wanted.
While there's a break in the action, we got about 35 minutes left.
Okay. Well, but you are making connections though. So what are those connections between Peter and in the epistle versus Peter in the? Mark?
Okay. So the blog article
or Matthew, because we're trying to be focusing on Matthew, but.
Yeah, and I would recommend. I think you would be interested in this. So you're already doing master's theses on these subjects. I think you'd find this fascinating. I would say I cite all the scholarship, like the leading scholarship on this, and go into many examples in my blog article, Mark's use of Paul's epistles. So if you go to my website, search for that, and I go through the examples, and then I cite the bibliography of scholarship, so you can actually go and read them as well.
Also, sorry, I have to make a very important point. I don't know if you remember your debate with Trent Horn, but he talked about the drinking game. I only took one shot. I'm only taking one shot.
The children's game. You mean the children's game? Are you talking about the one where people blindfold you and then hit you and say prophecy and you have to guess who hit you?
No. The one where every time you mention your work that.
I see. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I've been very limited in what I would cite here. But,
I'm only doing one. That's it.
I'll jump in. Cheers.
It's important too. Right. Well, I'm drinking a little bit of wine. I'm having a nice little Cabernet. I'm not usually a fan of Cabernet, but it's what I've got.
Pinot here.
Another example is, a clear example is how Mark takes the Eucharist narrative from Paul and inserts a bunch of people and action in it. There are no people present in the Eucharist narrative in Paul, for example.
So I have to argue against that. So Paul doesn't say no one else is there.
Well, yeah, he doesn't say that, but he doesn't have them there. And the words of Jesus are directed.
He's not giving a story either. He's just saying
words. Well, he is
themselves.
kind of. Yeah, it's quotations of Jesus and the whole thing. And he talks about the actions of Jesus. But they're all directed to the future church, right? This is Jesus speaking to the future, not to people present that he's interacting with. Whereas Mark has almost verbatim from Paul. Like he's taken almost the exact same story. And Paul, of course, says he got this from the Lord. So Paul got this in a dream or from a vision of Jesus. Like he's getting it from what we would not consider a reliable source, whereas Mark is using it from almost word for word from Paul, and then he inserts people and interaction, and now Judas is in the story, and now we've got other people that he's interacting with. There's a whole narrative as to where this happened, and other things that Jesus said at this occasion that are beyond the things that are in Paul. And I agree with you, like yeah, it's entirely possible that you can explain this on historicity of the Eucharist story. You can explain this without Mark knowing Paul. It's just that the odds start to go down. It gets suspicious, and then when you have like 100 of these from Mark to Paul, the odds of all of these coincidences, it's just too many coincidences. It's too many, right? So it's the number of them that I think is the big problem. And for people who want to really see this, check the article. I have dozens and dozens of these, and I go into more detail from the scholarship, a peer-reviewed scholarship that make these arguments themselves, as to why these things are so suspicious by themselves. Anyway, but more interesting. Let me ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
Ask you a question. Why don't you want this to be the case? Why is it? So it sounds like you want Mark to be completely independent of Paul, like to not have Mark telling Paul stories in the form of Jesus. Like it seems like you need that to be true.
I was debating.
Why is that?
Yeah, I was debating whether or not I was going to ask this question. I decided not to because I didn't want to come across as mean. But like, I copied, for instance, and I'm going to answer your question in a moment. I'm prepping it up.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
I copied a quote that you sort of found from someone in I think one of your Skepticon lectures or something like that, and you give a sort of description of Christianity associating Jesus as a Jewish zombie, all that sort of stuff.
Oh.
Yeah,
right.
You know, whatever. And if we're going to get into fantasy, he would actually not be a zombie; he would be a lich. But that's neither here nor there.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
but,
it's a joke, right?
Yeah.
It's not.
But you do
not meant to be taken
present it
literally.
as okay. You do present it as 100% true. Like you literally say that. And I'll take it.
Yeah. In the context of metaphor, like so. Good example is what you just said with zombie.
No,
right?
you said like it's 100% what we believe as Christians, which I would harshly argue against for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. It depends on exactly how literalist you're going with that. Like, so zombie is not meant to be literal reference to a specific type of creature in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monsters Manual for D&D, or something like that. It's a catch-all for the category of person.
My whole point is that that indicates
in humor.
Yeah,
it's important to note that when you're using humor and you say something like Jesus was a zombie, you don't mean literally a zombie. You mean that it's in the same category.
Yeah.
It's in the same category of being, right? So
that's actually my point, is that
I could say Jesus was a revenant, but no one would know what a revenant was, right? So I'd have to sit and explain the folklore of revenants to the audience. No, just say zombie, people understand what you're talking about. So don't take it literally. It's a metaphor.
But my whole point is that it's sort of it's a very insulting sort of joke, which indicates a sort of either disrespect or dislike or hatred of Christianity, which would
this gets to your point earlier. Okay, but go on.
Which would then give evidence to a sort of a bias against Christianity and a desire of some sort to not want Christianity be true in some sort of way or whatever, or to sort of stick it to the Christians or whatever. And I can psychoanalyze that, which I'm not wanting to do, which is why I didn't want to bring it up. But so now on to me. I've actually kind of anticipated a question like this. So for me, my ultimate desire is I want to know what truth is. All right. You may believe or not believe, whatever. I'll tell you financially, I could be making so much more money as a non-Christian doing similar work because I teach and I can be a professor.
If I converted to Christianity, I would too. Man, I'd be I'd be making bank. I'd be the new Lee Strobel. But no, I totally get it.
Yeah, there you go, Lee Strobel.
Yeah, I totally get you and respect where you're at on that.
Yeah. So for me, the reason I pointed out the agnostic part during the opening with that was written and everything is that this might sound whatever, but I genuinely wanted to not believe in God. I genuinely wanted there to be no God because, especially as a college age student, I wanted to do whatever I wanted, especially coming out of fundamentalism, So.
Oh, I see. So you're right. You started fundamentalist, had your agnostic phase, and then
and
went
then
to
became
Anglican.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So for me, and I obviously, we all have hidden biases and all that sort of stuff. But from my own perspective, I've been trying to be as truthful and honest with what I've seen concerning the evidence and claims and all. So I switched my major from English to philosophy because I wanted to learn more about philosophy and see whether or not God existed. I didn't find the atheist arguments convincing, all that sort of stuff. So, yeah. I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question, but
I guess no, but
okay.
but it was valuable to hear. So that I mean that So that was
okay. So connecting it to the Mark thing. For me, I'm just not. I don't see a reason to connect them. I don't see literary connections of any sort whatsoever. I don't. I see.
Yeah, neither did I. Right? Neither did I until I read
the only connections I do see.
That was when I started reading the scholars.
Yeah, but the only connections I do see are things that would be connections if there were a real life Jesus anyway. So if there's a real life Jesus who does do the Eucharist, then Paul would have that because he's received it. But then also we have Mark who's received it from other people.
Right.
And they're going to be the same thing, the same event.
But that's a faith argument, not really how scholars. Because mainstream scholars, like the majority's consensus is the Eucharist is made up because there's no way Jesus would have said any of those things. That's actually the mainstream view in scholarship, that this was something that the community invented later. Now, the question would be, did they invent this as a story about the historical Jesus? Or is it, as Paul seems to represent, something they saw in visions? And that is an argument that's a little higher level, and
I'd have to
it's
look
harder
into
to
that.
find that. But
I'd have to look into that because my understanding of the scholarship is that actually the claim that Jesus is anticipating his own death is the one that the consensus of scholars would.
Well, the whole Eucharist
rather than the meal
does
itself,
more than that, right? The Eucharist has a lot more elaborate stuff going on in it that it would make no sense in the context of Jesus' actual ministry. But and Gerd Ludemann is probably the best writer to read on this. But to go back to the point we were talking about, is I highly recommend you go look at that blog article of mine, look at all the examples, and then read the scholars, like the peer-reviewed scholars. It's not just me saying this. It's when you start to see it all that you have this eureka moment. You're like, oh my God, like why didn't I see this before? Because I was in the same boat, right? I thought I've changed a lot in how I perceive what Mark is doing in his Gospels. I started out thinking, oh, he's kind of like a simpleton. It's a very simple Greek kind of thing. But no, it's actually, Mark is a literary master. He writes like Mark Twain. He's writing in a colloquial dialect on purpose. And he's master at constructing stories. It's actually, I have tremendous more respect for Mark as an author now that I have studied specifically how Mark composed in these stories. So I think it's, and then that's how I see and discover these things about how he's constructing stories out of Paul's epistles. But I highly recommend going into it. I really do think that you will find it very fascinating. It's right up your alley.
So I'm hoping that we can finally get to sort of the age of Ignatius, and I'm sorry, it's going back and forth and all that.
Sure.
But I don't know how much time we have left for open.
I don't know. Do we want audience Q&A? I saw some questions fly up, but I couldn't see them.
We still have a whole 25 minutes.
Okay. I want to go on to moving to Matthew, then Luke, then John, etc. Although I think you put John before Luke now, don't you?
No.
Oh, I thought you put
John is definitely. No, John is definitely.
I thought you put Luke as like 113 or so, 115.
Yeah, John is later. Well, Luke is after. I put Luke after 93, as most scholars now do. I think he could have written as late as 115, and if he did, John still had to have written after, because John is responding to Luke. John is a rebuttal to Luke in many respects.
Right. So we moving on from Mark and Paul and all that sort of stuff. You're arguing, it seems, that sort of Mark is only drawing from either from Paul's epistles or at least from the Pauline community, right? And a sort of.
Are you saying that I think that that's his only source that he's using, or?
Well, I mean,
I wouldn't say
I'm presupposing my sort of historicist understanding anyway, because
you're
arguing that you're understanding it to be sort of intentionally.
I think I can reframe what you're trying to say. Like, I do suspect. Now, I don't think I can prove, and it's not necessary for my argument to prove it, but I do suspect that Mark is the first to do this. That there were no placing Jesus in Galilee as a minister before Mark. I think Mark has invented it all. And as someone always does, like the Ned Ludd biographies were invented whole cloth. The Romulus narratives were invented whole cloth. The Moses story was invented whole cloth by someone, right? And so there's nothing unusual about that. So I do suspect that that's what Mark is doing. But I don't claim to prove it. It's possible that people had already been experimenting with this kind of construction before Mark, and that Mark might be using some of those models. That's possible. I don't see any evidence of it, but I don't think it's impossible.
So. But your theory does, I think it seems, rely upon. Well, that's not the theory. That's the actual conclusion that it's just it's made up from other false
that
false
someone
narratives
did.
or
Yeah,
something like
right.
that.
Someone at some
Yeah.
point had to invent this.
And then you would
selling it,
reject
right.
Q. You would reject Q as well, right?
I do, but it's not necessary for my argument.
Okay.
Right? I can still build the same argument with Q, because Q is still written in a foreign language in a foreign country. It's still not a Palestinian document, right? It's still Greek. It's still based on the Septuagint.
So then the question about Q, then, I mean, these are largely just sayings of Jesus and all, or I would say obviously Jesus, but you would say whoever. Like who like, is it just one person? And why didn't that person like become famous? I guess you could say, or whatever.
It's the same reason that the Moses story was invented, right? You have this massive, elaborate book of Deuteronomy, right? Was written putting massive amounts of words into Moses, or really into the tablets that Moses walks down the mountain, right? Yeah, this is what people do. Like, this is how literature was written back then. There's nothing weird about that.
I obviously very much disagree with the idea of Moses being a myth, but you know.
Okay, well, that's
of course, yeah,
you're going against mainstream scholars there. Yeah, well, we
I have no problem with going against mainstream scholars.
Yeah, sure. I just want to make that clear. That
that's why I'm trying to defend a minimalist approach. I just want to clarify that for people.
A minimalist approach would be mythicist in the Moses case, right? That's literally biblical.
No, I'm talking about Jesus specifically, because that's
right. Yeah, I get what you're saying. You mean you want to avoid making too many assumptions, and which I agree. I think that's you should be doing that.
I'm trying to be as neutral as possible with share as much neutral territory as possible.
Yeah, and I think your methodology is right. It's just I think you might be confusing premises with assumptions, right? So you can have premises, but if you base those premises on evidence, so for example, I gave the example of religious literature in antiquity was typically fabricatory. That's evidence. We have extensive evidence of that was the normal mode of composing literature at the time. Most mythologies, most mythographies, hagiographies are about non-historical people. These are facts. That's empirical facts. So we start from. So that's not an assumption. That's a premise for which I have evidence.
You have plenty of hagiographies of, for instance, the early church of people who actually do exist and all that sort of stuff, and hagiographies of the Caesars and
right. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that all hagiography is of mythical people. I'm saying that when you get all ancient hagiographies together, all the mythographies, and you count how many of them are of historical people and how many of them are non-historical people, most of them are of non-historical people. So that tells you what the trend is. So if you want to prove that Jesus is counter-trend, you need more than the Gospels to do it. The Gospels are not enough to do that. If all you have are the Gospels, then you're just on trend. And so to get more than that, you need something else. And then my argument is that we can't find that other thing, whatever the other thing is.
Yeah. So for me, then the question goes to the sort of the four Gospels themselves. It seems that you have to, I think, almost necessarily sort of argue not only a particular order of the Gospels, Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, then John, but that they sort of are all like have final copies of each one, and that they're sort of drawing from those, exclusively, and not drawing from any other. Like you have to posit that they're just making up all.
No, we don't. Yeah. We don't have to posit that. No.
Okay.
Obviously, they are drawing on each other a lot. That's true, but they are. They're all creative authors. I mean, Luke invents the Ennius narrative out of the Romulus narrative. That's a classic example of that.
I really have to disagree with that, but keep going. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's it. That was all I had to say.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the issues, I don't think I actually brought it up, is that when you're making these sort of comparisons, you have these sorts of two standard, not standards, but like 2 points where like, well, we see parallels, but then we also see dissimilarity. But everything is either a parallel or dissimilarity, is it not? I mean, if you would elaborate more on that.
Yeah. So, I would just direct people to go look at how we do this everywhere else, right? Like, forget the Gospels, forget Christianity. Just look at every other aspect of literature in the ancient world. How Virgil emulates Homer, how Plutarch emulates other authors before him. So you look at how all these authors do this, and there's a lot of authors who've written on emulatory literature. I mean, not just Dennis MacDonald, but you have Richard Miller, Ava Chitwood. There's all these scholars have analyzed how all kinds of ancient literature is riffing on other ancient literature. We have tons of examples of this, and there's nothing weird about it, right? Like, we don't suddenly, these parallels are just random accidents. No, there is a structural, proper way to actually show that parallels are actually meaningful and actually causal, that they're not just random coincidences. And this has been done in biblical studies with, for example, the Moses story and the infancy narrative of Jesus, right? Very good example of that. But we have many other examples of these kinds of emulatory stories. especially in Christian literature too. We have an example in the Middle Ages of a biography of Judas that emulates the Oedipus trilogy. It actually it takes the Oedipus trilogy and maps Judas onto it and retells the Judas story based on that, illustrating the way that this was done. Like, this is a thing that they did a lot back then. And there's a technique, there's actual literary art and science to this, of figuring out how you can identify meaningful literary parallels versus random noise. The way, like, a lot of mythicists do find random noise and think that they're finding something significant. So you are correct that there is an invalid way to do this, but there is also a valid way to do it, and it's done all the time outside of Christianity. There's nothing. We're not introducing some special bleeding into Christianity. We're using the same tools we apply to all other literature. We're just applying them to the Christian literature.
I would say some of the examples. So, for instance, like Osiris is one that you point to. You then point to the idea of the sort of dying and rising heroes, or you've even limited it beyond that to sort of suffering and rising heroes. But any story, whether true or false, like any person of importance, whether real or fake, is going to have suffering and rising if they're a hero. Like, that's
not in the same sense, right?
It doesn't have to, but Osiris is not the same sense as Jesus.
Yeah, and I don't think Jesus
Mithras,
is. I think I even say the exact words. I'm not sure if it's exactly on the historicity of Jesus, but I said the exact words. Jesus is not Osiris 2.0, right? Like, no one mentioned the Gospel of Osiris and just copied it over to Jesus. No, the parallels are all they're actually common to all of them. So one of the examples is the third day motif. The dying dying and then rising on the third day. That's all over the mystery religions. We have tons of examples of it, and it all predates Christianity. And so for Christians were borrowing this idea even before they historicized Jesus. They're already borrowing the third day dying and rising motif from the mystery cults of this, and they're Judaizing it. They're making a Jewish version of it in the same way that the Jews borrowed resurrection from the Zoroastrians. The whole idea of the apocalyptic linear history with the general resurrection at the end times. And the idea of Satan as the enemy of God, that there's this war between good and evil. That is all a lift from Zoroastrianism. But what the Jews did is they Judaized it. They turned it into a Jewish version of it. So they made changes. The changes are the things that make it acceptably Jewish. But it's definitely a lift. Before the Zoroastrian influence, none of these things exist in Judaism. You can go to the earliest books of the Bible, and there's none of these things. But it starts to appear exactly when the Persian influence starts to appear in the Jewish history. And so the same thing, I say the same thing.
The Satan you see in Job, for instance, is one example, though.
Say again?
The accuser in Job is one example, though.
Well, Job is actually transitional, right? So
he's
Job,
not post-Babylonian exile or anything like that.
Yeah, but it's a transitional book because Job is not even Jewish, by the way, right? You know, Job is a Gentile.
Oh, he's pre-Abraham. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the story actually predates the biblical version of it. And in Job, Satan is still part of the angels of God. Satan is actually God's right-hand man who's the adversary, Satan meaning the adversary. He's still taking God's instructions and going up and down from heaven and doing things for God.
About 15 minutes left, gentlemen.
That was written before they adopted the Zoroastrian idea of making Satan the fallen one who is the enemy of God. That's intertestamental literature development that happens in the centuries between the closing of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New.
I'd have to disagree, but I think that's getting way too far afield.
It's getting really far afield, sure.
So I think one of and I guess we can end with this and go into question and answer, Q&A and all that. But the big part for me is sort of what happens to where sort of the mythicists lose and the historicists win, and there's no evidence for, them existing. Yeah. Not no, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Actually, I don't. Like, I don't understand your question.
Okay, we don't see against the mythicists like we do see against against heresies and Satan.
Right. Yeah. The anti-heretical literature doesn't appear until like 200 years after the religion begins, or 150 to 200 years. So, and by that point,
Ignatius
they're talking about
and Second Peter.
Ignatius is talking about Christians who didn't believe that Jesus really did any of those things. He believed that they were mythological, just like Second Peter.
But they didn't believe Jesus was a mytho. But Second Peter and Ignatius don't.
I think it really sounds like it. Yeah, if you read the original Ignatians, not the later forgeries, but the
shorter retentions. The shorter retentions, yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Don't read them through the lens of presumption. I
try not to. I mean.
No, I'm just saying, oftentimes people read them assuming that Ignatius is talking about later Docetism, but he's not. If you look at actual Docetist teachings that are talked about in the heresiological literature, they do not line up with Ignatius, what he's talking about. So if you just read Ignatius independently, just see what is Ignatius saying, it sure sounds like he's talking about mythicist Christians. And so we certainly can't say he's not, because he doesn't explicitly say that he's not, right? So there's nothing in the Ignatius that really indicates that he's talking about some other kind of Christianity that's not mythicist Christianity. And we have the example of 2 Peter, where it's very clear that Peter had to, whoever wrote that letter, had to fabricate an eyewitness testimony to refute these Christians who are claiming that these were fabricated myths.
But the mythicism you're promoting that is within sort of your understanding of St. Paul and everything is actually a bodily Jesus who is in the heavens and it never touches earth. Whereas whoever St. Ignatius is responding to is actually talking about almost kind of the inverted.
You're doing the thing. You're doing the thing. That's the thing you shouldn't do. You're making assumptions. You're making assumptions. You're looking at Docetism from 50 years later. Well, that's why assuming Ignatius is talking about them. Yeah. But if you were neutral, you wouldn't do that. You would go to Ignatius and not assume that. And when you do that, when you go through it with clean eyes, you would notice that he's not talking about Docetists. It's not the same stuff.
I'm not even committing myself to the idea of Docetists. I'm talking about what he's talking about. He's talking about where they claim that Jesus didn't really have a body, and that it only
more than
appears
that.
to have a body.
He didn't really have a mother. He didn't really eat food in front of the disciples. He didn't really die in front of the disciples.
That goes all. No, he didn't have a body. He
wasn't really crucified by Pontius Pilate. That's in Ignatius, right? So that sounds like mythicism. I'm just saying.
No, but it's not that he wasn't crucified by Pontius Pilate because it never happened. He wasn't really crucified by Pontius Pilate because it was an act, like how Muslims would.
See, that's not in Ignatius. You're importing 50-year later heresy that's completely different from what Ignatius is not talking about. That. Yeah, if you look, you'll see. If you look, you'll see.
I love
use
Ignatius.
The assumption. Go actually read it.
Ignatius is who helped me become Anglican. But anyway.
When you look at what Ignatius is talking about, go try and find an actual Docetist text or reference to Docetist teaching that aligns with it. You will not find it. It is a modern construct, a scholarly construct. There's no ancient text
that because I don't think I agree. But okay, but then also 2 Peter, because you do point a lot to 2 Peter, and 2 Peter. I mean, obviously, I don't believe it's a forgery, but you, of course, do, and all that.
Okay,
but that's neither here nor there.
That would be a fundamental disagreement. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's neither here nor there. That's not relevant to this. The question is, he's pointing to people claiming that we did not follow cleverly devised myths. That is way too generic, I would say, to point to a mythicist sect, because literally anyone who's not a Christian or anyone who is a Christian accusing other people of like I would say to a Gnostic, you're following cleverly devised myths, or I'm talking to you. You're following cleverly devised myths.
You're ignoring the rest of the argument.
Okay.
It says we did not follow cleverly devised myths. We were there. We actually met Jesus. That's basically what he says. So whoever.
Well, he's talking about the resurrection part. Yeah.
No, he doesn't. It references the Transfiguration in Mark. It's almost quotation from Mark of the Transfiguration.
Transfiguration would be something different from the idea of Jesus existing at all.
No, but the point is, he's saying like there are people who said we believe in cleverly devised myths, but his argument then is that no, we were there, we saw this stuff.
Yeah.
So the actual context here is that someone had to fabricate an eyewitness testimony to actually seeing a real historical Jesus in order to respond to these people. You got to look at what is he inventing to respond to this argument. That tells you what the argument actually is.
So you're putting to the Transfiguration.
It's important that there's other Christians. So these Christians would not have any reason to doubt the Transfiguration necessarily, unless that they actually had this idea that people weren't there, so they couldn't have seen.
Or would you claim that we don't know as much about the Ebionites as we would like to say?
Well, we don't know. We certainly don't know that about the Ebionites, but no.
Well, they have a much more humanized. This
is later literature. Like we don't have any evidence of Ebionites in the first century. We have no documents.
Well, you don't even consider it to be first century, though. You don't even consider the Ebionites to be first century.
I don't know. We don't have any literature.
I'm sorry.
The thing is, like, I don't think we can
Peter.
make claims about things we don't have any documents of. So we don't have documentation.
I meant 2 Peter. I'm sorry. You think 2 Peter is first century?
I do think it's second century. Yeah, I'm with mainstream scholars on that.
And I'm not, and I'm proud of that.
Sure.
No, but my point being that it could be something like the Ebionites, or some sort of sect that does not.
I see no reason for
Jesus Christ is. Well, I see less of a reason for claiming that.
There's nothing in 2 Peter that's anti-Ebionite in particular. I just don't see what you're saying.
Well, if you're claiming that he's pointing to the Transfiguration, that's my point.
I don't
Because
see how that connects
Ebionites-
to Ebionite. What is
Well, because
claimed by
that
Ebionites?
would be a
Important to note, we don't
recognition
know
of-
what the Ebionites believe. We only know what their enemies claim they believe.
Yeah,
But even based on that, I don't see how there'd be any connection to that.
But my point being that it's a recognition of some sort of divine recognition of who Jesus is and all that sort of stuff, which would be rejected by either the Ebionites
really.
or by
I don't see why. I really don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a zillion assumptions that you're using to get to that conclusion. I agree with your minimalism that I don't think we should be basing our arguments on all these assumptions.
So what I'm doing is I'm
minimalistically-
trying to do is I'm trying to point to sort of I think I'm coming across as trying to do like a same standard as you are doing, where you're pointing to what I'm saying is an assertion of it being mythicism, and I'm saying I can make that assertion as well about the Ebionites as an example. I'm not saying that I actually think like necessarily.
Except you have no evidence for what you're saying about the Ebionites, right?
No.
So you're trying to present a counterexample that doesn't exist. This is not what I'm doing. I'm presenting an example that does exist.
What is the example that does exist though? What
These are very different examples.
You're assuming a sect that does
I'm
not.
just reading the text as it's written, right?
Oh,
That's the thing. I'm importing no assumptions. I'm just reading what is written.
We all import assumptions. That is
I'm just making inferences from what is in the text and not importing a bunch of assumptions about what he could possibly otherwise be meaning, for which I have no evidence, right? So you got to do it that way. You can't just start with this architecture of assumptions.
But you are assuming that when he says cleverly devised myths, he's not talking about any particular myths as much as that Jesus even existed.
Oh no, I'm not assuming that. That's actually.
Oh, maybe I'm misunderstanding then. No, okay.
No, because that's actually what the argument is. That's the thing, is it's myths, and then he goes on to the whole elaborate gospel, people who deny Christ, etc. It's not like he doesn't say like people are this one myth, they're denying this one thing about the transfiguration, and no, we want to confirm this one myth. That's not what's going on in the text. That's not in the text. The text is giving an example of an argument to refute a general position. That's how the rhetoric is formulated in the text. That's how it plainly reads.
If you think we have enough time, and if you're up to it, would you sort of do the exegesis in front of me for it? I've got it. If we don't have enough time, that's perfectly fine. I understand.
We don't. If we're going to take more time, I'd like to throw questions to the audience, actually. And people who want to know more about this, you can find stuff on my blog about this. I've written on it, and you can go deep dive into it there, I think.
Okay. We have 6 minutes left.
We can go a little long. I'm all right with that. I mean, if you are. We can go a little long if you want to go longer than 6 minutes, but...
Okay, that's fine. So after the open discussion ends, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to send a super chat so we can have those ready. But yeah, we have 6 minutes left. Give or take.
I thought I saw some questions roll up. Do we not have any already from the audience?
I have a list of questions from the comments that I just have waiting.
What do you think, Father Gad? Do you want to? Yeah. What do you think, Father?
I have plenty of time. I'm good. Yeah.
So I just want to get into the Q&A then.
Yeah.
That is totally fine.
That's what I meant. Sorry.
Well, then let's get started with that. First question is for each of you. Which evidence would change your mind on your position of either the Gospels or the historicity of Jesus?
I can go first if you want.
Yeah, go for it. I have an answer, but I'd love to hear yours. Yeah.
I have a few different ones.
Actually,
for me,
I bet I could predict what your answers are. But
please
go ahead.
do.
I don't want to. You'd already mentioned it. I think you'd already mentioned an example, like if we found an against mythicists text, right? If we found some sort of
that wouldn't convince me.
Late first century. Oh, it wouldn't. Oh, okay.
No, it wouldn't.
That would be an example of something.
It would be
when you mention evidence that's not present. That suggests that you would increase the probability of the position you're against if it existed.
That could increase the probability.
Right.
That's not. Yeah.
It wouldn't be sufficient.
That would be a knockdown. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I would respect that. Yeah.
Okay. So if I was convinced that God did not exist, I would not care at all. For instance.
Oh, whether Jesus existed or not, you mean?
Yeah, it would not matter at all to me.
As a historian, I'm fascinated by that. It matters to me as a historian, regardless. So.
Oh no, yeah. But obviously, Jesus is much more than a historical figure for me. That's what the collar's for,
Yeah.
So all that. But aside from that, if I did see sort of if I saw something either positive from Paul saying very definitively that the Jesus is only someone who's only ever existed in the heavens and under the moon or above the moon or whatever, or something like I saw what I found to be convincing evidence that the Gospels were like clearly just myth and not with a real character behind them. In fact, it'd have to be, I think, a few hundred years later for me. But those sorts of things, that would be enough evidence. Maybe not necessarily enough. It depends on the nature of it, but that would be much more.
Yeah, I think I do mention some examples on the historicity of Jesus. If we had there are epistles of Paul that we don't have. Because we know Paul references them. Now let's say we found them, and we could confirm that they're not forged, etc. What those letters said, they could say either of two things. They could explicitly describe the mythicist thesis, saying Jesus really died and resurrected in the heavens, etc. Or they could actually reference things that like talk about a debate regarding something he did while he was alive, or something like that. You could do either one of those things. Either one of which I think would hugely skew the odds in favor of the obvious direction. So like if we had a letter from Paul where he says something that very clearly indicates Jesus was historical, I think that would clinch it. I think that would be decisive. Like it would not be that mythicism is impossible, but its probability would drop tremendously, and to the point where that we should really dismiss it as improbable at that point. Conversely, if we had a letter where Paul just explicitly owns it, and which we wouldn't have because the historicists wouldn't preserve such a letter, which might be why we don't have these letters. But we don't know that. We can't know for sure what were in these missing letters. But if we had that, I think that would skew the evidence. I would no longer be saying it's 1 in 3. I would be like, no, it's like 1,000,000 to 1 that there was no Jesus. If we had that letter, right? So that would be the kind of like smoking gun. And I don't think we have smoking guns in this case, on either side of the debate. I'm not one of those physicists who claims that, but.
Yeah. May I ask a quick question concerning that, just real quick? Sure. Concerning the disputed epistles of St. Paul, I focused more when I read your book on. I didn't read the whole thing. I focused mostly on Matthew and Gospels and such. Do you talk about the disputed epistles and sort of see whether or not there's historicity in there, and what are your thoughts?
Not the ones that not really.
Okay.
For efficiency's sake, in chapter 7. I start from premises like, if, for example, if the consensus says something and I can't present any argument against it, I'll just take the consensus, right? And so in that, the consensus is like the pastorals, and the pastorals would be the ones to talk about.
I'm talking about the 3 disputed ones, though. Like
so real quick, I don't want to go too off.
Oh, I see. I don't think there's anything that supports historicity in those, so I don't think it matters. But the pastorals would be more important for historicity. But yeah, what I do is I say, well, the consensus is that these are inauthentic. I footnote the scholarship and say, so I'm not going to discuss them. I do occasionally, very briefly, discuss them, but I don't spend a lot of pages on it for that reason, because it's an argument I don't need to make to my peers, because most of the scholars in the field already agree that those letters weren't written by Paul. So for efficiency's sake, it's already like a 700-page book. I couldn't put like another dozen pages on the disputed epistles.
All right, let's get to we got a super chat here from my one black friend. I'm gonna get canceled just for reading that username.
I promise I won't cancel you.
It's their username. You didn't attribute it to them. So.
Yeah, jokes. It's a question for both. Is there something that God can do right now to prove that he exists that could not happen if he didn't? Thank you for being kind.
That's a question to me, right? Because we're talking about.
That's for both of you, but it says for both.
Okay. Yeah.
So
you could retailor it for Father Gad that would convince him that Mormonism was true, for example, or something. I'm trying to pick a sect that you would never think true. Like, what would it take to convince you?
That's fair.
In my case, it would be very difficult to convince me that God is a nice guy, but to convince me that God exists, all kinds of things could happen. I mean, if I went through all the things that the kid goes through in Time Bandits, I would be pretty convinced by the end of that God exists. I'd also be convinced that he's a terrible person, but I would be convinced by everything I had seen in that scenario. That would be the kind of thing that could happen. There's another example there's this TV show called Miracle Workers, the first season of which all takes place if people die and go to heaven and become angels and stuff. So if that happened to me, and I could get assigned to the administration of God in heaven and so forth, God in that is also not a nice person. But that would be the kind of thing that would convince me that God exists. Either of those things. Like I would have to he just has to come talk to me, and he has a lot of explaining to do. But there's a difference between explaining as to why he hides. That's one thing. That's different from explaining why he fucked everything up. Did everything very terribly. So I have a lot of complaints about the management on this issue. I could go total Karen on God, I think, but that would be different from whether he existed, right? Like I can agree he existed and not like him. That's those are two different things.
If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend reading "Till We Have Faces" by C.S. It is my favorite C.S. Lewis book.
Wait, say that again. You cut out a little.
"Till We Have Faces." "Till We Have Faces" by C.S. Lewis.
Till We Have Faces?
Yes. It addresses that.
I'm familiar.
I love that book. It's amazing. Anyway, I guess the negative would be, I guess, convincing me that God doesn't exist, I guess. Is that what we want to go with?
Yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah. It's really, and this might sound really bad, but again, when I was a college student, I was trying to, and it just seems so, not just improbable, but incoherent. Every sort of explanation of how the universe can exist without God just did not make sense to me in any logical way. Prime mover argument is a really big one for me, and other things like that. So we can talk about the nature of God from there, but the idea that this ball started rolling somehow, it has to be, for me, a willful starting of the ball rolling. So.
All right. Cool. Let's move on to the next question then. This one comes from Corpse Grinder.
All right.
Y'all are really trying to get me in trouble with these usernames. God damn.
All right.
Is almost every other scholar working for a church that makes them sign mission statements?
I know what this question is about.
Yeah.
So David Fitzgerald wrote a book, Jesus, Mything in Action. Actually, a 3-volume set. But in volume 1, and I recommend this book, it's actually really good. He actually undertook a study, sort of informal study. He got a bunch of people together and actually started calling universities where professors, prominent biblical historians, actually worked, and tried to find out how many of them are actually on binding statements. In other words, they would get fired if they were to ever suggest that they doubted fundamental principles of the religion, which means that they have no academic freedom, which is, when you're under the gun, literally, to affirm a position, that's worse than bias, right? You're not even at bias at this point. We're beyond bias. You are literally forced for your living to take a position. I think they found roughly 1 in 3. This was the case. So not everyone, but a lot. That's a high frequency.
But I think we would agree that the ones who would be more willing to accept something like a more mundane Jesus or a mythicist Jesus would not be likely to go to those 1 in 3.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll tip the hat to you. I seriously doubt, I didn't check, but I seriously doubt any of them are Anglican. Right? I don't think there's any Anglican schools that mandate that you sign a dogma agreement.
There are.
Really?
There are, and yeah. Well, you're conflating me with the Episcopal Church, which is you don't even need to believe God exists.
I was being serious about Anglican. Yeah. I wasn't aware that Anglican.
No. Episcopal is also called Anglican, but Episcopal.
Yeah, I know. Episcopalian is kind of the American break off. Anglican is Church of England, but
no, not even that. It's within the United States, there is Episcopal, which tends to be considered liberal.
I didn't know there was an American Anglican. Yeah. Okay, I always assumed it was CV. Okay.
It's complicated. We're a little weird.
Okay.
A lot weird.
Are you a little more conservative than Episcopalians? Theologically conservative, not ideologically.
That would take a bit too much time to get into, but we are definitely more conservative than the Episcopal Church, but not conservative in the Baptist way.
Right. Yes. No, I would never imagine. Yeah.
It's a fundamentally different mindset of conservative.
Yeah. That's been my impression in interacting with American Anglicans. Yeah.
All right. I can attest to that. My degree is in biblical theology. I had to sign a lifestyle agreement when I was in college, saying I wouldn't drink and I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't do that.
I'm sorry.
That's
the same
that's
scholar,
different.
the same standards apply.
That's different from an ideological
classes.
Yeah.
We would smoke and drink after classes.
That's different from an ideological commitment statement, though. So like we're talking about you promise never to question biblical literalism, for example, like those kinds of statements where you're actually signing away your academic freedom to actually speak freely and think freely. I mean, I'm also against lifestyle agreements. I think those are stupid as well. But yeah,
within reason, I hope. Like, you know.
Yeah, of course,
reason.
right? Yeah, yeah.
I think I recall in Dr. Barterman's debate with Wayne Lane Craig, he asked him if he thinks that there are contradictions in the Bible, and Dr. Craig refused to say yes. And Dr. Ehrman was like, well, of course you're going to say that. You'll lose your job if you agree that there are contradictions in the Bible. So yeah, I think that is
that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Yeah.
Speaking of Barterman, the next question.
Barterman's watching? Oh, wow.
Barterman always comes up whenever Richard Carrier is present.
Yeah, I doubt he's watching, but
Dr. Ehrman always comes up.
Yeah.
So this next question comes from James. James is tired. That's a much more safe username. Thank you for that. It's just a quote. It says, the idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedence. It was made up in the 18th century. One might as well call it a modern myth, the myth of the mythical Jesus. So I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, we've already referenced examples.
Yeah, you talked about this a little bit earlier with Docetism and everything.
There's also a reference in when Justin invents a Jewish opponent in dialogue with Truffaut. There is, and you can read it in the original Greek, and it really is very clear that there is a suggestion that a Jewish author says, "Oh, you just made him up." Justin was willing to grant that a Jewish opponent might actually propose that, and his response to it is to act indignant and to threaten to leave. He doesn't actually have an argument against that, but that's how it. And they change subject, and the dialogue moves on from there. So that evinces an awareness of people who were willing to question the historicity of Jesus. But by that time, when Justin wrote, like, no one would know. Like, it would be very difficult to actually prove that he didn't exist. It would be easy to prove the stories are ridiculous, but it would be almost impossible to prove he didn't exist because they didn't have the access to the kinds of techniques that we have today, much less all the archaeology that we've got.
If I respond to that part, sure. I actually think that, honestly, I think there is, like, we're missing a lot of things that we wish we did have, like his writings and all that sort of stuff. I mean, like, I think, if anything, there's kind of a better position there in some ways, because it's much closer to the time and everything. But I do want to point out that sort of someone just asserting, oh, those stories are crazy, he obviously couldn't exist, as a sort of offhand remark, I don't think it's the same exact thing as sort of, oh, Jesus mythicism as a sect. And I think you would agree on that part, yeah.
Oh, I see what you mean. And then if you're talking about that specific thing, then you're looking at Ignatius, Ascension of Isaiah, Second Peter, and things like that. But or even just the letters of Paul, I think. But that's, that would get into a whole separate argument because we were focusing on the Gospels today.
Yeah. So real quick, we're gonna do the Q&A for about 18 more minutes.
All right, sounds good.
So next question comes from Blake Clegg. Would Scientology be an example of how a religion can take flight with little background or truth?
I mean, I don't think Father God
it's an odd question,
disagrees with that premise that a religion can take flight with very little evidence. So I think it's maybe a question that's kind of a non sequitur here, but I don't know. What do you think, Father?
No, I agree. Yeah. Like, Scientology doesn't even sort of posit a sort of, one of the issues I do have is that the Gospels are, at least whether or not they're actually doing this, they're portraying a sort of like somewhat within the lifetimes of their writing kind of thing, like the same century at the very least. Whereas Scientology is talking about before we were even monkeys, I think, or something like that kind of thing.
That's a good point. I think Scientology is an evolution of UFO cults. There were earlier UFO cults in the 60s. And 70s and 80s. And when you get to, like, let's say, well, I can't actually say this for sure. I don't know about the Heaven's Gate cult, what they thought about Roswell. But Scientology, if Scientology had been based on the belief that a flying saucer with alien bodies had been discovered at Roswell, then we would have a better parallel there. Now, there are millions of people who believe that. And the myth was invented around late 70s, early 80s. And millions of people still believed it then and still believe it. So that actually does show you the 40-year timeline. It takes about 40 years for a myth to easily catch on of something that never happened. And you could say that, well, there's a kernel of truth there, the tinfoil in the desert. But you could say that of myths Christianity, there was the visions of the Christ. So there's a kernel of truth, for sure. But there was no flying saucer or alien bodies, and I'm just saying that there was no Galilean Jesus, right? So that's the flying saucer and alien bodies, not the tinfoil in the desert. Tinfoil in the desert is the visions.
Side note: Congress has been looking into it and all that fun stuff, and the CIA. Not Roswell specifically.
You're talking about the UFO study report.
That's been interesting.
Yeah. I blogged on this for people who are interested.
Yeah. Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was only a summary report, and it was super.
Podcast.
Yeah, it was a summary report, and it was super useless. It was a totally useless report.
That is a belief where I'll fully admit that that's something I want to believe is true. I'm a huge sci-fi guy.
I get that. No, I respect that. Right.
All right, so we got another super chat from my one black friend again. He says, I can't let you off that easy. God can heal every sick child in the world. Why won't he do that? Even if two Christians pray for it. Father Gad, I'm going to guess that's for you.
Yeah, okay. So this is the question of theodicy, and I think that there are two approaches to the question of theodicy. There's the question of it from a logical standpoint and the question of it from an emotional, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, standpoint. So from a logical standpoint, there's no logical necessity. Like there's nothing that logically necessitates that either God can exist or evil can exist, and not both. That has to be demonstrated rather than asserted. When it comes to the emotional one, which is that it's logically possible still, but nevertheless, it's still really like why would God do this if He's so loving and kind? There are a few different approaches to this. I think honestly the best one for me is the fact that within Christianity, we have the idea of God himself coming down to earth and actually partaking in the creation and partaking in the pain that is happening within the world itself. And in order with that to bring us back outside of the pain by the reunion and sort of perfection of creation with the reunion of heaven and earth together at the end of this age. So that's a very short explanation, but theodicy is or the question of evil, I should say, is the strongest argument against the existence of God, and I will never deny that. It's just I've never found it convincing enough to sort of block out the existence of God in general. So.
Yeah, there are quite a few books written on that topic alone.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Job is my favorite book in the Old Testament, and it's one of the I think it's the earliest, or it's definitely one of the earliest. And it deals explicitly with this problem. And what I love about the book of Job is that it actually doesn't sort of really give an explanation. It just sort of shows that Job goes through these troubles.
It does actually. It's just not a nice explanation.
It doesn't give that calm. It's just basically sort of like, I'm God, you're man, shut up, basically.
Yeah, I can do what I want. Yeah, it's literally, I can do whatever I want. Yeah.
For me, like that, at the end of the day, go ahead.
And it's not the earliest. It's one of the earlier. There are fragments in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that are much of.
I'm thinking about the whole book, though. Yeah.
That's a whole other thing.
I mean, we could do a whole talk just on the whole show just on that. But there are elements of Job that are similar to a story told in Plato about the difference between a just man and a man who only pretends to be just. And it actually involves crucifixion. He talks about a just man is the one who would have to have all the reputation of being an evil man, but still continues to be just. Even being crucified on the cross to the death, he remains a moral person. That would prove a genuine just person. Whereas if you had someone who could be as evil as they want, but have all the reputation of being good, and the assumption is that that's how most people behave. Job, of course, is the one who remains faithful despite all of this, and so he illustrates the moral man model. No matter, even though he's treated the horribly, he still maintains faith, and that represents the excellence of Job, right? So that's the actual message of the thing. I don't think it's a nice message at all, but that was the message they were teaching it.
Slightly connected. I just reread the Consolation of Philosophy. It's one of my favorite books of ancient literature. I love it.
All right, next question comes from Almost a Doctor. Would it be more likely that a Jesus character is based on a single person or multiple people who became amalgamated, which is a word I don't think I've ever read in my life, amalgamated.
I don't think it's
I know
ever
what you mean.
pronounced that way. Yeah.
I know what they mean.
If there is a person at the base.
The religion, of course, started long before the myths were written, putting them in history. So I think some people confuse these. So when Mark is writing the story, there is some evidence that he's borrowing some of the elements of Jesus ben Ananias from Josephus's War of the Jews. It's not conclusive evidence, but there's some that he's using that model to model part of the narrative of the crucifixion of Jesus, or the passion story of Jesus. But Jesus ben Ananias has nothing to do with Christianity, and he was in the 60s AD, not the 30s. So the religion had already existed for decades before Mark decided to use this other Jesus as a model for one tiny part of his storyline. So even if you buy that he did that, that would be an example. And now he's borrowing Moses and Elijah and, let's say, Romulus. And so, yeah, so there's, most mythical models, but there are some historical models perhaps that he's borrowing, but he's only, even if you agree that he's doing that, and I think Father God would dispute it, but even if he's doing that, it's only literary. It's only a literary function, and it's only in Mark. And later. It's not. You can't explain the origins of Christianity by an amalgamation of historical people. That's not what's going on here.
If Jesus is an amalgamation of historical people, then effectively mythicism would be true. And obviously, I reject that idea. I don't think there's sufficient evidence for that. I would say that Dr. Carey, and you've written this in your books, I think, definitely at least in not Proving History. What's the second one called again? Sorry.
Well, the first one is On the Historicity of Jesus.
On the Historicity of Jesus. Isn't Proving History before that?
Proving History is the methodology. I don't actually argue against historicity, but...
but you did Proving Methodology, or Proving
History is the method, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, you do argue that, it's possible, obviously, that there could be a kernel of some sort of Jesus, but it's just so buried behind.
Yeah, and that could be true. Yeah. There could be a historical Jesus, and Mark used a different Jesus to build part of the story out of, right? So, so that possibility is there. So then you have to get into what is the probability, and then that's when you get into the weeds of evidence and whatnot.
Yeah, and obviously I disagree, but
yeah.
So next question comes from also almost a doctor. This one's for Father Gad. We have miracle claims from Emperor Vespasian. We know he existed, but we don't accept those claims. How do we know Jesus isn't the same?
So I don't...
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. No, it was directed at you. I think it should go to me, but you answer it. Yeah, I would like you. Yeah.
If you want to respond, Dr. Carey, you absolutely can.
So I don't necessarily claim that other religions and sects and all that have some sort of miracles or things like that. In fact, we have evidence of this within, I think it's Matthew actually, where there are other people who are healing, but not in the name of Jesus. And Jesus says, if you're for me and all that sort of stuff. No, that's not a pluralistic mindset. I'm not an Episcopalian again, but if you look at even the Moses, which I again obviously consider historical, what's happening? It's the snakes that the staffs that turn to snakes. That's not the power of God. That's some other power. So I wouldn't just completely cut them out. Now at the same time, I would have to look into individual examples to see whether or not I consider that to be an authentic miracle. My understanding of miracles that come from God is this. I wouldn't put it in a sort of probability mindset. I would actually see miracles are a sign from God telling us what sort of the meta narrative of the world is up to that point, indicating it's like a stop sign saying, hey, look, this is what's happening at this point. So you see it with Elijah, Moses, and now Jesus, or not now, but then later Jesus and all that sort of stuff. These are sort of signposts that God is saying, hey, pay attention. So
yeah, I think I thought the intent of the question was, I might be wrong, but because miracle stories were attached to Vespasian, shouldn't that suggest that we should doubt the historicity of Vespasian? And if that's the question, there's two reasons why that's not the case. One is, if you're talking about a reference class of merely people to whom miracles were attributed, that reference class has mostly historical people. So that's not enough to be a mythologized person. You have to have there's got to be tons more mythologization going on before you fall into the class of mythologized heroes. And in that class, most of the members are not historical. So that's the distinction between those two things. The other thing is that on the other side, that's the prior probability. And then when you get to the likelihood ratio, the evidence for Vespasian is vast, such that if we had that evidence, for Jesus, we would not doubt his existence at all. I would be writing a book completely explaining that mythicists are crazy, right? If we had the kind of scale of evidence for Jesus that we have for Vespasian. And it's not that we should expect to, because Vespasian was an emperor of a massive empire. Like, so the fact that he leaves a ton of evidence is expected, whereas like Jesus could have been just an itinerant preacher of very little renown when he actually existed. So they're not comparable in that regard. So I don't think that in and of itself is an argument against historicity either for Jesus.
All right. I got one more question before we close out the show. After the question, I believe John will pop back in here and close things formally. But first, this one's for Dr. Carrier. It's from Blake Clegg. He says, does Dr. Carrier ever talk about the fringe of ideas like the tomb of Jesus in Kashmir, which would agree with Muslim thought?
Okay, I've never realized there's a Muslim connection to that. Interesting. No, I don't.
Yeah, I didn't either.
I'm not interested in medieval legends. I'm interested in the origins of Christianity. So that's not, and it's just a personal interest. It's just, I just don't do that. It's a lot of freaking work just to study origins of Christianity, to then get into like Indian, we're talking about like, Indus Valley medieval legends. That's not even my wheelhouse. I don't even have the languages for that. So no, I don't study that. I don't talk about it much.
That's fair. Yeah, I'd never heard of the tomb of Jesus in Kashmir.
Yes,
I'm gonna need to
you
look
can
that
go
up for
visit it.
myself.
There's a claim that Jesus left all the way and actually died after his resurrection. He went to India and died, or went to Kashmir and died there. And they show the tomb. It's just like the tomb of that they show for Jesus in Palestine now. It's very similar. It's venerated and so on.
So now I'm wondering how that is connected to the myth about him going to India or traveling to India when he was like a child and teenager.
Yeah, I think that's a later and unconnected myth, but it could be a connected myth. I'm not actually sure because I have not actually checked into that. But it's all late. It's all medieval. It's not ancient.
Yeah,
There's
so many.
No ancient.
Saint Thomas is reputed to have gone there, and he is claimed to be the twin brother of Jesus. That might be what you're thinking.
Yeah.
That's the ancient myth, but there is actually a medieval myth of Jesus did that, and I do think there's a connection. I think the Thomas myth kind of inspired the later Jesus myth. We're talking about the medieval Indian Jesus myth.
No. All right. I think that's about it as far as questions. Let me make sure I didn't miss any super chats. No, it doesn't look like I do. So, cool. John, at any point, if you want to hop in here, and we can end the show.
You're definitely muted. All right.
Amateur hour.
Come on, John.
All three of us.
Yeah, I know. I'm total total amateur here. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate everybody being here, asking questions and everything like that. I want to say big thanks to Father James Gad as well as Richard Carrier for having the discussion tonight, and also thank you so much, Captain Dadpool. If you guys want to, you can go and follow Dadpool on TikTok, YouTube, Twitter. I think he's got a Discord too. Yeah. So now just a little bit of a cleanup. We've got a regular schedule this week. Here in a few weeks, I'm actually going to be having Richard Carrier back on to discuss a video by Holy Kool-Aid and Bart Ehrman. So that'll be in a few weeks. Yeah. Ooh. And so if y'all will bookmark that, I've already got the stream up, and Rick, I will get you that link afterwards. It'll be a great sequel to this,
actually.
Yeah, I agree. But in any case, I hope that you guys had a lovely time tonight. Definitely check out the Crestus app, as well as both of our guests here. Richard Carrier, richardcarrier.info. I don't think Father Gad has a website or anything, but if he has 5 books on his hard drive, I'll definitely get that out to people.
Oh yeah.
Oh, YouTube channel. That's right.
Channel.
So sorry.
I do have a YouTube channel.
Yeah, right. Barely,
and it's also a Facebook page, but yeah.
Yes,
that's a great name. Oh, yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Yes, so please check out Barely Protestant here on YouTube. And I guess that we will see you heathens tomorrow for some biblical contradictions. And I believe that I'll take us out on the little end card thingy. Nope, I don't have that loaded. Anyways, I guess we'll be done. I will. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.